Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm Elizabeth Schwab, your podcast editor and one of today's hosts. I also serve on the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network dedicated to learning, teaching, organizing, advocating, and innovating for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of programs, from preschool through higher education, as well as in non-formal and community learning spaces. Today, I'm joined again by Chrissy Rodelius-Palmer for the second part of our conversation on feminism and human rights with our three inspiring guests, Eugenia Ricciotti, Tata Varadashvili, and Zeynep Karatas. Together, they share their experiences, perspectives, and commitments to advancing human rights and gender equality through education and activism.
Thank you all. The next question is, are there any feminist movement leaders or ideas from the past that still inspire you? Or do you feel the movement has had to reinvent itself entirely?
I can try and go because I use this question as an icebreaker for some of the interviews. To some extent, I've come up with an answer. Personally, I draw a lot of my inspiration from Audre Lorde's writings on intersectionality especially, and self-care as like a radical act. And in general, the organizing strategies of women of color, indigenous feminists, and the working class activists throughout the past decades I still think that they provide a great and invaluable lesson for us today as well. At the same time, today's movement had to reinvent themselves to respond to new challenges, going back to online platforms, mass media, misinformation, and whatnot, including like the intersectional aspect right now goes beyond what it was maybe at the time. And now it's not just about the person. So it's not necessarily just about race, religion, sex, class, but it goes even to as far as climate justice or environmental security would be my answer.
Totally agree. Love Audre Lorde. I already name dropped them, but I am really inspired by the Combahee River Collective because, again, they're a feminist group, but they do not see feminism as separate from like economic liberation or racial liberation. Like all of these things, as Eugenia said, are intersectional. And I think it's so cool that like these women were so ahead of their time in a lot of ways and like left this legacy for us to follow, because everything I think they say is like super, super relevant, which again, in some ways it's disheartening because like how much progress have we made that all of these like issues that they're outlining remain relevant in modern day society. But then on the other hand, again, it makes you feel like you're in the struggle together. Like there's these decades long work that's been done and you're just one part of it and continuing to move the wheel forward. So in that sense, I think implementing the ideals set by the past, depending on the context, is probably the way in which I think the feminist movement needs to continue, because again, all of these things are historical. They're kind of building on top of each other. So we can't like separate 90s movement and 2000s movement and 2010s movement in that kind of way. But I think also in just incorporating the knowledge that we gain from each other, as well as historically silenced communities, and then responding back to the new issues that come up just with the problems of the time that the movement itself is set in.
I think a lot of things were said, so I'm just gonna keep it brief. For me, it's really hard to come up with someone I view as my idol, but I really like Bell Hooks and I really like her books. We had a couple of classes where we talked about feminism, and I think her critiques are very valid, and she talks about this intersectional feminism and how, for me, what was very interesting of her is that how she was one of the first who kind of talked about like this kind of discrepancy between Black women and working class women from like white and middle class women. So kind of like highlighted this hierarchy within feminism as well, which can be very detrimental to kind of having this collective soul and community soul. And I also really like her attitude towards love and patriarchy. And in regards to your second question, if things are changing, I think obviously, as Eugenia and Zeynep both already mentioned, a lot of problems and adversities are emerging on a daily basis. So obviously things changed, but I think something that is very, very important is to kind of to solve the issues that emerge every day, to fight it as one, while also acknowledging differences. Because obviously we all would like to say that there is equality, but as it was already mentioned, a lot of African American people struggle with having the same benefits as a white woman would have and kind of like the privileges they would have. So I think it's important to kind of understand the importance of standing together and fighting together, but it's also important to acknowledge that this are also the problems. And there is a difference, which is also a really big problem, and we should also fight against it, but it should not stop us from fighting a bigger issue, which includes everyone. I hope it makes sense what I'm saying, but yeah, that was it.
Thank you. And building on what you've all discussed and those that have really influenced you, how do you think past generations of feminists, including those from the Beijing Conference or the ones that you've even cited here, have influenced the activism happening today?
Might be a little repetitive. I think Tata already mentioned this, but like the fact that Beijing was able to highlight that women's rights are human rights, I think we kind of take it for granted that like those things are synonymous in a lot of ways now. But I think like at that time, I imagine it must have been, I don't know, a little bit of a shocking revelation for some folks, again, who want to like separate everything into these categories and kind of make things seem as though they're not interconnected when they are. So I think that definitely informs at least the way in which I think of these sorts of issues, right? It's not like, oh, I go ahead and protest racism on Monday and sexism on Tuesday and then environmentalism on Wednesday. All of these things are the part of the broader human rights framework and must be understood together in that kind of way. And then also identity politics, like what does that mean? Again, the term I think is understood in a very negative way because of far-right interpretations of it at the moment in like general media. But again, at the end of the day, the original way in which it came from was just recognizing total liberation can look different for different folks, but it must not stop us from coming together to work towards ensuring that patriarchy is not impacting anybody, right? Like it's not only women or it's not only girls who are harmed by patriarchy. Since Tata brought up bell hooks, I will like name drop her, right? Patriarchy is produced in the house by parents. It's produced in the workplace by managers. It happens when your teachers are enforcing certain gender ideals that are like not real, as though they are synonymous with how you were born. And then that's where like issues of emotional immaturity or seeing women as not dignified members of society, all these things come from. But it also impacts men in a way in which they might not be able to express their emotions. And that causes a lot of further complications for them. So I think that kind of understanding that and human rights frameworks, in my opinion, are the main ways in which I see today's movement being inspired by fast collectives.
Yeah, it's really hard to add right now. I think Zeynep kind of covered everything. So I don't know honestly what to add. I think something that came to my mind is that I think a lot of there are, as we discussed, same problems still visible in today's society and also new problems emerging. But I think they set a tone and kind of showed us the way that resistance is important and resisting the harmful patriarchy and harmful narratives are important and is the way to go, because we all know that patriarchy is oppressive. But I think it's sometimes very hard to speak up if you have not been shown a way how to do it, or if you don't know how, because it's very, very scary thing, especially in today's political landscape, as Zeynep mentioned, far right. It's really hard to speak up against the institutional injustice that obviously favors men. So I think they already kind of set a tone and showed us that even though they were further oppressed just because they were speaking up, it's important not to back down and fight, because without fighting, it's going to be even harder to exist in this very unequal society already.
I will not add anything on this note because you both said it beautifully. So I'm going to change it a little bit. And I may be completely wrong and off, but from my understanding, something that started in Beijing and that we still see today is like a global dimension of feminism, in the sense that Beijing brought together women from the farthest away region possible, from the most remote areas of the world, together in one place, giving them the same space, the same platform to share their experience. And it kind of built a network for the first time, which someone made me realize it was also at a time where like phones and emails and internet was starting to be more in use. So it made it also easier to keep in contact and in touch with people from Nepal or China or the US and Africa and Albania. I don't know. So it kind of gave a global dimension to feminism that we still, to an extent, see today. Obviously, we have to be focused on what's happening at a local level, because that's what touches us the most. And it's what we can probably have a bigger impact on, just because it's geographically close. But at the same time, like we saw protests that sparked from the US all the way in Europe, or for example, the protests for George Floyd, or the demonstrations for Palestine that take place every other week in most cities of Italy, and I'm pretty sure of other countries and cities in Europe as well, and not only. So that's not strictly related to feminism, but it was kind of my way of saying that activism has taken a global dimension, and to an extent, I think that it started, or that it could have started, in Beijing.
Thank you. I think highlighting both the women's rights as human rights components and the resiliency and the resistance, as well as kind of this global phenomena of kind of movement, are definitely a number of the components that came out of that Beijing Women's Conference, as you've identified. So do you see any, building on that too, are there lessons from the work that you've been citing that you think are still useful today? Maybe some specific strategies that you think we should really, as we're looking forward and beyond, should try and highlight and use?
In my opinion, I think we kind of covered it a little bit, but obviously many lessons are still relevant today, especially the importance of like this coalition building and having clear and actionable goals. But at the same time, we also need strategies that are up to date, that kind of teaches us how to navigate digital spaces or countering disinformation. And obviously pushing for feminist policies in a narrow democratic backsliding, to say the least.
I think, kind of agreeing to Eugenia. Something that I think is also very, important lesson is related to kind of resistance, but in this case, fighting against institutional and governmental injustice, as in kind of like fighting to be heard, but on the level of policies and laws, because I think a lot of policies and laws neglect women, again, because of the narratives that are present, and this superior complex that men have. I think it's very important to fight to be included in legal systems as well, because to be protected legally is also a very, very important aspect. I think Eugenia probably knows a bit more about it because since she's a lawyer. But I think it's very, very important the rights to be acknowledged legally as well, because obviously we all want the same thing. But if the country legally isn't even able to help us out, I think it's going to be even harder to kind of make the point and then prove the point and fight and keep fighting and keep resisting against the injustice.
Completely agree with everything said, as always. I think Audre Lorde was already mentioned, but I'm going to highlight self-care again as a political act, because I think especially when you're living in such a globalized world, it just feels like bad news all day, every day. Like if I look at the news 10 times a day, I will see 10 different types of ways in which like women's human rights are compromised. Like it's not going to be, unfortunately, very much, even if it's good news, that can also like cause some level of stress in certain different ways too. Like it's just constant information being fed to you. Or if you're engaging in protests, like any form of long-term change takes a lot of time. And so caring for yourself, community building, making sure that you're connected with both your normal life, but also more importantly, in some ways, your activist friends who understand the same type of struggle, I think is really important. And then in that way, kind of, I guess, focusing on mutual aid. This is, again, not just for feminist politics, but I think all types of social justice. Everyone has their own ways in which they can contribute to the community, using our strengths to make sure that the resistance is endured and that we are finding ways to, again, continue being active members of our communities, and in that way inspiring and continuing to be inspired ourselves. I just think all of those are super, super important because it can get very overwhelming very easily. And this should not be a sprint, it's a marathon. So not burning out, I think, is the key to any form of activism.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess taking those strategies and looking forward to today. If there were a new global conference on gender equality today, what topics would you want to be at the center of the discussion?
This is such a hard question because, like, for instance, I think in this case, a lot of aspects should be considered because, let's say, if we talk about access, kind of forbidding early marriages and children marriages, a lot of people, even if it was discussed that children's rights should be universally protected, a lot of countries would not necessarily take that into consideration. So I think in this case, I think I would talk a bit more about cultural relativism and the importance of different cultures and how many things vary from country to country. Because we say that everything is universal, and I would really much like, let's say, women's rights to be universal and acknowledged globally and universally to the same degree, but that's not the case, as we've discussed and kind of established already. So I think a very, very important aspect to kind of finding, I wouldn't say necessarily but like a solution or a possible and proper approach is to understand that different countries and different cultures, like they're different and they vary. And the problem of, let's say, children marriage, for instance, cannot be universally resolved just because of it. So I think that's something that should be highlighted a lot from my perspective.
Yeah, if I can just quickly add on, I completely agree with what Tata said in the sense that, like, if you don't have cultural relativity, I think it's really easy for folks who are not familiar with a certain place to just come in and not work within the system or work in a way in which it causes further damage. Like, I remember certain cases, for example, where I think an issue of adultery being punished with stoning, which of course is inhumane, was trying to be resolved, but the way in which I think certain European activists approached it was, oh, this is inhumane. Let's start protesting. Let's start kind of showcasing the culture there as dehumanizing. And it sparked this backlash that kind of caused that whole case and for that woman's situation to worsen. And the way in which it ended up being resolved was local activists interviewed, local women who had already been in that culture and knew how to navigate these types of problems. And they were able to work within the legal system to ultimately save her. But I think it could have been even like handled easier if those women's voices were amplified in the first place and the activists who were coming in were saying, how can we help you, rather than being like, oh, actually, you don't know what you're doing. Let us take control of the situation because we know better than you. And cultural relativism isn't being like, well, just because it's your culture, it's okay to like forego child marriage. It's not that. It's just the way in which its approach should be happening is through amplifying local voices and how local women who are like much more knowledgeable than we will ever be, how would they approach it and how can we best support their efforts? So I completely agree with Tata on that front. And then I think I would highlight economic liberation, because I think it's just so hard to not highlight how capitalism has transformed our world when it comes to anything related to feminism. Like, for me, I hope the end goal of a feminist world is not, oh, let's have everybody have this much pay so that like we're all equal, but more so, I hope all labor is recognized and that people's lives are not just solely surrounding around who can be the highest position in a factory, like in a company, but rather, so is everybody fulfilled in their life? Are we working so that our communities are in support of each other? And are we making sure that the labor that we're doing is not causing further inequality and disruption somewhere else just because it's far away? Like my people's understanding of Western form of liberation can cause further discrimination in other places because all these systems are so interconnected. And I think it's hard to kind of talk about it a little bit. It gets too theoretical. But for example, like the end goal of, in my opinion, feminism should not be me becoming the CEO of a company if that company is using like labor violations in Myanmar where women are being forced to endure horrible working conditions. Like that should not be. That was not a collective way of envisioning feminism for me. So I think recognizing that, again, that interconnectivity of even economics and trying to create a better system that empowers all of us rather than certain ones of us, I think is super important. I talked a little bit too much, but also climate change. Shout out to it because it's getting bad and I think we have to tackle it.
Everything that has been said has my complete support, even though I feel like I've made the mistake of, like, in the back of my mind, cultural relativism is always there, to the point that, like, even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a universal declaration of human rights, it's a declaration of Western rights. And then I went on saying to myself, oh yeah, but we also should talk about how capitalism is, like, it's not, it reinforces gender inequality, which is true. But it's true in a Western society where we actually use capitalism, even though it is kind of expanding. But the things don't necessarily have to be like one or another. We can talk about cultural relativism and how economic systems such as capitalism, but not limited to that, reinforce gender inequality. The things that came to mind as a European citizen were mostly the fact that structural adjustment programs, austerity measures, and economic crisis tend to hit women harder the hardest in general, as do cuts to social services, especially to women, because they tend to rely on those measures the most, which brings us back to the gender pay gap, not to talk about the unpaid labor that they do in the household or raising children, caring for the elderly, and all of those things that we just associate to women because they've been doing it forever and we just give them for granted. And I see this with women that I consider feminists, and it pisses me off a lot. So I think we should kind of bring the attention on that as well. And another thing that it's not adding anything to the conversation, but I think we should talk about it because it's the main topic right now, is the rising authoritarianism and the backlash of the far right on every kind of measures that is related to gender equality and LGBTQ rights. And many of these regimes use traditional values rhetoric to justify the rolling back on like hard-won feminist gains. First and foremost, abortion rights, protections against gender-based violence, and equal rights legislation. I think that what is left for us to do is to kind of like strategize on how to resist and adapt. But it's something that I would definitely want to be talked about in a new World Women's Conference, I would say.
Well, I want to attend the next World Conference that you hopefully will be creating, because I think you've raised some really important key elements of what could be the topics that such a conference would be undertaking. And linked to that, I guess, as a leaning into one of our final last questions, if you could ask someone who attended the Beijing Women's Conference or an elder in the movement one question, what might it be? And maybe it's building on the questions that could be guiding this conference, as well as we think about this intergenerational look. You know, maybe it's what's a question for the younger generation. So feel free to jump in on either question.
Maybe for older generations, something that I would be genuinely really curious in knowing is that back then, like Beijing Conference was obviously seen as a very, very big step towards achieving equality. But I would ask them knowing how big of a step it was and putting all this much effort into kind of creating something meaningful. Did they expect the world to turn out this way, despite their constant tries to change it, because I think at least because I was not born very long time ago. So I don't know how it was back then based on the research and like people I've talked to. Obviously, the problems still stay. Some problems still stay and continue to be a problem. So I think that's something that I would ask them. Yes.
I feel like what I've been doing for the past few months has been asking women who attended 1995 conference something about the conference. But so far, my favorite questions to ask and to like listen to the replies that everyone had to say was one piece of advice that they would give young feminists, which is kind of turning the question around again, because it just shows you that there's so many ways of doing activism and to tackle the fight for your rights, and that everyone has a different way of approaching it or engaging with it. But the goal is like we're always all going toward the same goal. And I think that really sums up the feminist movement for me. And on a similar note, I would ask a younger feminist, what do they consider as activism? What is for them an act of activism that you can do on a daily basis even? That would be my question.
For younger activists, I would also want to ask them how we can best support and amplify their voices, because sometimes I feel like we complain about not being given platforms, but I'm sure their time will come where they'll be like, you could have done this much more. So even at this stage, I would love to ask them to be like, how can we make sure the things that sometimes we had to experience do not have to repeat themselves with your generation and with the older generation? I'm going to echo very similar to what's been said, but I wonder how motivates them specifically, if it's an individual motivation or if a more general motivation when it comes to working on feminist movements, just because, like I just mentioned, I think earlier on, that it's a marathon, but in this globalized world, it can feel very overwhelming. I wonder if they think it's less overwhelming because certain things were a lot different and harder back in the day, but also with the rise of technology, our access to information has also altered the landscape, how they feel about this kind of transformation, and if they think it's different, and whether or not they have coping mechanisms. Would love some tips on that front.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your experiences, more about your work, your motivations, past work too. I'll echo what Christy said before. I think hearing you all speak today gives me a lot of hope for the future and the next generation as well. And also grateful for all the work that you have already done. So thank you.
And I want to just echo my thanks. As I mentioned to Eugenia when I was interviewed, I was 6 months pregnant with my daughter Chandra at the Beijing Women's Conference, and she's now pregnant. And I can say that I'm really excited to think about the future, because you all in this room who have shared your stories, you're quite the inspiration. So I look forward to continually learning from you and with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for organizing this. It was a pleasure getting to know you and hearing all about your experience and just talking honestly what we think. I think it has been a great experience for us as well. Thank you so much again.
Couldn't agree more. I think I had like goosebumps for half of the conversation, and it's not because it's cold here, I promise. I really enjoyed talking and especially listening to what you had to say, because we don't get to do that much. Like we work together, but sometimes we don't just talk about what we think. So that was really interesting. And I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Same. Just thank you so much for giving us your time and your platform to be able to amplify their voices. And I also want to thank Eugenia and Tata so much too, just because it's such a pleasure talking with you every single time. Like Eugenia said, it's so much fun. Would not have known about Beijing, not for you. So now I can show off my information. No, thank you. And again, Christy and Elizabeth, I really appreciated having you guide a conversation and making this such an open and safe space for us.
Thank you for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can also find more information about this series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. It can also be downloaded as an MP3 file. If you have any questions or comments, please email Christy@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Rodilius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and outreach coordinator Tia Hins, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.